I think when we talk about the quarterback position, I think one thing that's interesting, and some of the things that I'm just hearing, just as we're talking through, which is very bizarre, is that Oklahoma might be in the market to take another quarterback. Heard some, by some of the guys that I talked to that DJ Uiagalelei may be portaling at some point. That might Oklahoma could be a destination for him. Casey Thompson is a guy that, I mean, it would be very poetic. I guess interesting, ironic, whatever the word you want to use for him to come to Oklahoma after him being at Texas and things like that. So I think Oklahoma's doing. And I'd heard a little bit of this just today. So I think um, I didn't really think, Clemson didn't have a great year, but they played much better down the stretch. That didn't necessarily play great in the bowl game offensively, but um, I think DJ's a guy he's a really interesting kid because he in his games last year he played very very well, in Trevor Lawrence's absence, and then wasn't necessarily as quite as good this year. But obviously that offensive line, um, plays into that and makes a big difference, right? So those are the things that are just interesting to see how they play out. The portal is just it it's just crazy. Like, it's crazy the number of kids that go. I mean, I don't know that there's anybody that would go into the portal that outside of maybe like a Bryce Young or somebody like that I would be even surprised at this point.
Yeah, so a few things to hit on there. One would be just with the carousel of quarterbacks shifting places, the strategy that some guys have in selecting a spot is a bit intriguing because they're trying to go to a high level program, but to try to find one of those that doesn't have legit competition at the position is going to be difficult to come by. So, yeah, there's going to be competition everywhere on one hand. In regards to, you were talking about, oh, shoot, who did you bring up at the quarterback position? Who were we just, oh, DJ Uiagalelei at
Yeah.
Clemson. Yeah, it's somewhat interesting that, and of course, the quarterback takes way too much blame, too much credit, and a lot of his issues were, as we talk Clemson football on our Clemson channel once a week, we've got, they had a wide receiver core for years and years and years that was arguably the best in college football that has really been downgraded the last couple of years. Ton of dropped passes. The offensive line, as you just mentioned, not up to the standards that they need to get to and win playoff games. But he had performed so well in difficult circumstances, considering, boom, he gets thrown into the Boston College game after Trevor Lawrence tests positive, and he's only got a couple days to prepare as the starter, and they get down by 3 scores. He leads them back to a win. Then he goes to Notre Dame, and even though they lost the game, he puts up 40 points. He puts up over 400 yards, puts up the highest single game passing mark ever against the Notre Dame defense. So a lot of us, and I'll admit to falling into the trap, just assumed this guy's the next Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, maybe not quite to that degree, but he's just going to take over, and they just keep going because he's already shown it in 2 or 3 games. And boy, they hit a wall and they really struggled on offense. And it was him, but it was all facets of that offense. So I don't really know what he's capable of. I know he's got a strong enough arm, and he certainly got a strong enough build. He's a tank as a quarterback that is a menace in the open field to bring down. So he would be
absolutely.
a project to a
Yeah,
certain extent.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think it's very intriguing for if Oklahoma. I mean, if you're if you're DJ or if you're Casey Thompson, do you go into a situation knowing that you're seriously going to have to battle, for that starting spot, knowing that, because I think I had read this the other day. I didn't really know. I think Gabriel has a couple of years of eligibility remaining. I think the thought was, he's just a rental for a year, but I think he has at least 2 years of eligibility remaining, maybe even 3. So for Oklahoma, so yeah, that'll be interesting. And I'm like you, Mark, coming into this year, I probably had more questions about C.J. Stroud starting at Ohio State, more questions about Bryce Young starting at Alabama than I did DJ. So yeah, I mean I think it's interesting. I don't know that any of us thought that Bryce Young would be good enough to win the Heisman. Obviously knew he was a great player, but the first year in a system, maybe you're the guy that. But no, I mean I coming in fresh, I expected him to have a really good year, but I didn't know about Heisman.
The only thing that I stated repeatedly in the off season that kind of gave me confidence in that direction was, well, first of all, when does Alabama make a bad move? It just seems like everything that Nick Saban touches turns to gold. Number one. Number two, just that I know in previous years concerning a lot of successful Alabama quarterbacks, even going back to Greg McElroy and AJ McCarron, and certainly Jake Coker and others who eventually won national championships, Nick Saban didn't pull the trigger on a decision until August camp. He allowed that quarterback competition to ensue. And for Mac Jones to leave for the NFL and Nick Saban, even before they get to spring practice, basically to say, this is the guy, this is our starting quarterback, I was like, wow, okay. If he's that sold on Bryce Young, and he is a 5-star, and it's not like I had scouted the guy. He hadn't played anything but garbage time against a couple opponents and thrown a handful of passes. But so because of those reasons, and just again the Alabama component being just different than everyone else right now, I wasn't surprised. So
The law of averages has to at some point before he retires, he's got to make a mistake at some point, right? Like, I mean, maybe he did that, and you'll remember the name. I can't remember the kid that started the. Jalen Hurts came in for him halfway through the game, and then moved to South Florida. I can't remember the kid's
yes,
name off the top of my head, but that's the only one that I can. That's the only one that I can think of where he's really just
yeah.
not necessarily made a bad decision, but the kid just wasn't as good, wasn't Alabama level as a starting quarterback.